Hello, and welcome to our broadcast. Today, we'll be talking about passwords and how to make them strong. This broadcast is brought to you by Sigma Associates. Oh, thank you for joining us. Passwords. Password, as you all know, are some of the most important elements of our digital life. The interesting thing is that it's typically difficult to create a password. There's been a lot written and said about how the weaknesses in the passwords we create often lead to devastating attacks. And there's been a lot of parody about how we all seem to manage to create the simplest of passwords, like using numbers 1, 2, 3, or common names or common words, dictionary words often in passwords. The attackers tend to know how to replicate this, and the simple trick of running through a dictionary set of words with a computer that makes it very simple if a password is also made of those dictionary words or common names. So the things to do is to make sure that we avoid those pitfalls. For example, we should avoid using common passwords such as a sequence of numbers, particularly sequence of numbers that are just regular numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, birthdays, house addresses, and other such numbers that are easy to guess or easy to detect from a random online search. These are things we should avoid using. We shouldn't use our names. We shouldn't use the names of our family members as well in password because when we do, we expose ourselves to unnecessary risks. So then if we can't use all these common passwords, so what can we do? The thing about password is that they are as strong as we can make them, and they're as valuable as we can keep them. What that really means is that a password should be difficult for someone else to uh, guess or randomly search for, but it should be extremely easy for us. And that's the challenge. The holy grail of password is what's typically referred to as one time password, OTP. And these are essentially randomly generated, and the more randomly generated they are, the better. The longer they are, the better. So if we have 20, 30, 40 characters words, those tend to be much stronger as passwords than if we have 5 or 6 character words that are easier to guess. It's easy to generate a totally random numbers, particularly in Unix system. A simple way to generate a character-based random number is just to use the OpenSSL rand command. The rand base OpenSSL rand base 64-32 comes in handy, and we can easily generate. So if we say that 32, that means we generate a 32 character sequence. If we could increase the number of sequences, but basically, we just get a bunch of numbers and letters and some special characters. And this would give us a totally random number, a random sequence that we can use as password for certain systems. There's a weakness in totally randomly generated password though. And the key weakness in totally generated random password at the end of the day is the fact that they're totally random. And what that means is that they are almost nearly impossible to remember. And so if you can't remember the password, then you're compelled to write them down. If you write down a password, the mere fact of writing a password down decreases their security because now somebody can find what you've written and basically your password is gone. And so uh, even though totally random numbers are great, they have an inherent weakness in that we tend to have to write them down in order for them to be useful. There are exceptions to that, but most of the time that's what normally happens. Also, the systems we deal with every day also have their own constraints. And so when we think about many systems we've used, we've seen systems that would limit the number of characters in a password. Some now increasingly have minimum number of characters, which would be 8. and a maximum number of characters. Some would say it's up to 20. Um, there are still systems that do not have minimum number of characters, but the ones that have minimum number of characters tend to be a little bit stronger because now they compel us to use uh, more characters, which are much more difficult to guess than fewer characters, particularly if we use more different variation of characters in those 8 character string or more. However, when we are trying to create secure password, something that we can remember, it tends to be a little difficult when we're constrained by how many characters we have, particularly for some systems that have like 10 or 12 characters limit. And sometimes, in order for us to create something that we can remember, we tend to exceed that 12 character limit, and that becomes a problem. So you get systems themselves inherently constraining the design of stronger password. Types of acceptable characters. When systems limit the number of the type of characters to just alphanumeric characters, that is alphabets, which are usually English alphabets, which are 26 characters total. Of course, some will require that you have capital and small letters, so you basically have 26 times 2, which is 52 character space. And you also have, say, 0 to 9 uh, numbers. So you have about 62 characters in all. While 62 characters might look like a lot, it's also in itself inherently shorter than if we have a much broader spectrum of characters for use. Because the broader the spectrum of characters we have, the much more difficult it is to hack uh, a password. So systems, a lot of them today still have a lot of constraints that while they're intending to improve system security, they tend to hamper our ability to create generic, strong passwords. So when you start thinking about creating passwords, there are several things you need to put at the back of your mind. Again, we said earlier, avoid using house addresses or office addresses, avoid using phone numbers or any other number for that matter that is easily guessed or easily identified. Avoid using standard English words, nouns, and pronouns. Avoid using your names or the names of family members or name of anyone at all. Anything that you can easily determine and identify or you search using Google or any of the search engines available, it's fair game for hackers. And so, if it's easy for hackers to identify to find those number character combination, then the risk of using them is higher when you use them as your password. So, what do you have to do? The best approach to a strong password is to think of a password not as a name, but as a sequence of things that you can remember. So I would typically go for a sentence. The thing about sentences is that we can easily create any type of sentence. Of course, a standard sentence would include traditional words. Now, but if we start with a sentence, we have much more space to work with. And then we'll see that sentences themselves is not what matters, but they are a good starting point for creating strong passwords. Now, once we start with sentences, the next step is to now begin to change characters in those sentences and change them in a way that helps us randomize those sentences. So we combine letters and numbers together. We remove pieces of the sentence. And so we use special characters whenever it's permitted. Special characters are very powerful because they, like I said earlier, if we're limited to alphanumeric characters, then we have a 62 character space to work with. Of course, if we now expand that to between 8 and 20 maximum password length, we've increased the frequency. We've increased the space of the number of combination of number of characters we can have. But it's even better if we have the entire keyboard open to us. So now instead of about 64, we potentially could have more than 80 different characters, and that expands our combination options. Now, the key thing about password is this: they are as useful as we can remember them. If we have to write them down, we weaken the passwords. So we start with sentences, we combine letters and numbers, we use special characters as much as possible, and we make sure the sentences are sentences we can remember. So let's take a look at some password ideas. An example. So I have a simple sentence here. It says, I saw Star Wars last night. Take a look at what I've done with this sentence. In this case, I've used the entire characters in this sentence to create a password. Someone staring at this password would be hard pressed to understand where it came from. There are so many other ways to write to get here, but what I've done here is I've turned the first I into one, and to be consistent, I've just made I's one throughout the sentence. I've removed the spacing between words. And that makes it much more difficult to identify that all of this came from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 words. It's hard for someone to determine that without much more trial. Now, so there are indeed some repeated words in here because letters in here and characters, but this is because the sentence itself contained a number of repeated characters, which you would find is the norm in English language and many other languages as well. But the key takeaway is that the character space is now broad. Because we used a sentence, we are able to create a much longer password than if we had just picked up a number or a combination of number. While the numbers themselves, while the characters themselves contained regular English words, the way we've crafted it makes it very, very difficult for this to be guessed. The good thing about such arrangement that we have is that three people might try to create passwords from the same sentence, and they would all end up with different passwords because not everyone would replace I with one, and not everyone would replace A with A. In some cases, you could have replaced the A with an alpha or choose any other character sequence that you want. So essentially, you're creating two passwords by doing this. The first password is the sentence you created, which might be something that is known to you, something you can remember that most people may not be able to remember because of what the sentence means to you. But more importantly, your coding of the characters in the sentence becomes in itself a password within a password, and that increases the security of your password. Another example is I love Jane Fonda, and see here I've changed some of the coding. So the I is no longer a 1, but the shift 1 on most keyboards. And so you see, being able to play around with sentences to create strong password is a trick I've learned over the years, and I think it's something that is extremely valuable because you're able to code a password within a password. Now, once you've created a strong password, you can use them, but the fact that you've created a strong password does not mean that your passwords are always safe. Different websites, different applications, different apps have different rules guiding how they store password. While there are best practices on what should be done, it's not always the case that corporations or organizations follow those best practices. And even when some organizations follow best practices, they may have other leaks or other weaknesses within their environment that could potentially expose your password. So it's a good rule of thumb to work from a risk-based perspective. And what does that really mean? It means that like everything else in life, you try to categorize your password based on the sites that you use. So instead of having one single password for every site or having one single different passwords for all sites, you come to a compromise somewhere in between. And the idea being it's it's not out of place that the different websites you visit, the different applications you use, the different systems that require password uh, can be organized into a risk-based category. What does that mean? If you have two bank accounts in two different banking institutions, um, if they are both regular savings accounts, if they both have the same essential values to you, you can treat both bank accounts in the same way and use the same password for both of them, with the understanding that banks tend to have similar regulations governing them. And so those regulations require, and so many banks will tend to follow the same practice or principle when it comes to protecting your password. So it's not uncommon to try to use the same password across multiple banks. Of course, by extension, that means that if one bank is compromised, then potentially your account in other banks will be compromised. But in the big scheme of things, it's a safer bet to take that approach. And then when you go to a website a popular email website, if you have multiple email accounts, it's not a bad idea to use the same password for them if they fall into the same category. What do I mean by that? The emails you use at work, your work-related email, should not have the same password as the emails you use for home activities. And the reason being, uh, the nature of things that are supposed to be in your home account would not necessarily be the same as the nature of things that are in your work account. And so the categories will be different. As a rule of thumb, it is always good to have between 3 and 5 passwords at any given time. The key advantage is that it's easy to remember 3 different things at the same time, and so you won't have to write any of them down. It is much more difficult to remember 10 different passwords at the same time. You probably go crazy. And even if you could remember 10 different passwords, it's hard for you to know which website is actually which password. And so if you have 3, you can mentally decide this group have this password and those group have this password. And that makes things a little easier. Or if you have 3, you can actually categorize and write down the list of the different websites in different categories without actually associating them with the password, and you keep the password in your head as a key. These are good practices. Now, there are other people who have other ideas of how to manage password, and many of them would have a so-called secure place where they'll store all of their passwords and associate those passwords with different websites, and then use a master password to secure that space. The danger to all of that is that there is one single key that opens all of this. So the master password gets compromised, then someone has access to all of your different sites. Well, it's not so much different than the option we provided earlier, but it's much more riskier. Now, it's also much more cumbersome because now you have to figure out where that password is stored in order for you to access the resources you have to. And then when you do that too often, you begin to find a way to simplify the process, which is human nature. And so you end up compromising the password because you have too many of them. Another thing a lot of people do is to use a password management software. The difference between the password management software and you writing them down in an Excel spreadsheet are typically twofold. One, password management software tend to be tied to your operating system or browser, and so by extension, they simplify the process of reusing those passwords. And the second one is that you don't have to be the one to remember the password. So they're similar to the first password arrangement that you had, only that they're a little more automated versions of it. They suffer from the same weaknesses, except, of course, when they are stored in the cloud. Now, in the first instance, when they're not stored in the cloud and they're stored on your computer, you need to be at that computer in order to be able to access the sites. Now, when they're stored in the cloud in somebody else's environment, you've actually upped your risks because now all it takes is for someone to hack into these the provider of that password, and now they have access to all of your systems. The cool thing, I mean, the dangerous thing about this is that hackers prefer to go after big systems because their rewards are much higher. So instead of a hacker trying to target a million different homes individually in order to steal passwords from a million different people, if they know there's a single system that holds the passwords of a million different people, they'll likely go after that system. And when they compromise that system, now they have access to passwords for a million different people. So the inherent danger in that is one of the reasons why I typically I would advise people to avoid passwords software. There was a recent incident that proved this case to be true, where I think it was LastPass password website that was hacked into, and the password of millions of people were potentially compromised. So there's a risk inherent in storing your password in third-party system. So the ultimate best way to store password is in your head. Now, at the end of it, passwords themselves remain inherently insecure regardless of what we do. So uh, single factor authentication are inherently weak. So whenever you can, wherever possible, take a look at two-factor or three-factor authentication systems because now they've given you multiple factors to use to uh, access their system. The likelihood that somebody who have stolen your password will be able to successfully log into your system decreases if there's a second factor involved. For example, a token that is tied to your cell phone. Now, they would also have to have your cell phone in order for them to log into your account, and that raises the ante for them. So, regardless of what kind of password system you use, what kind of authentication system you use, single factor, multi factor, uh, multiple passwords, uh, risk based password system, one good advice is to make sure you change password regularly. Consider password like to be like diapers. You don't want to wear them for too long. So for passwords, you probably would think of between 30 days and a year maximum. The 30 days is should be for systems that are extremely sensitive. As a matter of fact, the more sensitive they are, the more regularly you should change password. And that is one domain that is left to system administrators. Regular users do not need to change password that often. For the average user out there, changing your password every 72 days or every 6 months or every 1 year for most password is not really out of the question. Now that comes takes us back to the idea of organizing the systems you log into and the passwords into groups. So when you're changing password, make sure you change them across all systems that share the same password. That way you don't go crazy when you're trying to figure out what password you use for what. Another good point, and the last point we'll be making tonight is never share your password. Password are personal, and you should consider them some of the most important and personal things you have. If you need to share your password, consider using a system that allows the other people to log in to the same system without using your password. The good thing about all of this is that the systems we use today, most of them now offer those options. One of the things, the reason a lot of people will share password in the past is that they want to share email box. Now it's easy to share your email box with someone else on platforms such as Google, there's a mechanism for doing that that ensures that someone else can log into your email using their own password if you granted them access. So there are now increasing opportunities, and if you have documents you want to share, almost every document sharing website offers you an opportunity to allow someone else to access those documents without sharing your password. So the reasons for sharing passwords continue to diminish, and so we should avoid at all costs sharing password at work or at home. And not just your password. Don't reuse password patterns. So the code within the code that I talked about in an earlier slide is what I mean by that. So don't share with other people what you typically would use to replace other things. So don't tell people I use the alpha sign to replace A, because by doing that you're increasing your risks of your password. With that, we'll come to the end of our broadcast for the day, and I want to thank you for joining us and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.